If you accept duty sex, you're giving the message that you'll tolerate not being chosen, that you'll take what's not being offered. So you're participating in a kind of sexuality that's humiliating to both of you. And it's a way of keeping the marriage from being intimate and choice-based. We are going to talk about duty sex. So let me just start with a couple questions and I'll just explain some of my thinking around it. And then I'd love to hear some of your follow-up questions or things that you would like clarification around. This person writes, what's the difference between duty sex and sex that your spouse doesn't initially feel into, but can get to a point of desire through conscious action? Is the second one not inauthentic? This person goes on to say, there have been duty sex times in our marriage where we both are aware, especially afterwards, that my wife, who has a lower desire for sex than me, was doing it for the wrong reasons. But then there are times when she doesn't initially have the idea of sex on her mind or initially is resistant, but can get to the point where she does want it. I can't quite differentiate between the two of them. And so I'm not able to understand what would be good and bad for our relationship. To have sex if she, quote unquote, doesn't want to, wouldn't it basically be any time I want to have sex and she doesn't? So let me just give you some clarifying ideas first around these questions and then kind of how you can think about it. So first of all, as I think some of you know, there's a distinction between desire and arousal. And this is based on some research that was done that Emily Nagoski speaks about. That is the idea that physiological arousal comes first and desire comes second. And what she means by that is that physiological arousal isn't something you choose. It's something that is to say your body responds with sexually relevant information or touch. So if you're being touched or you're seeing something that's sexy in the environment, you may have a physiological response to that sexually relevant information. That's different than whether or not you want to be sexual. So this can be very confusing for people who've been in sexually exploitative situations where their body might be responding, or their body's responding to something that they actually think is disgusting or abhorrent, right? And that it's confusing. Like, does that mean that I condone it? Does it mean that I wanted it in some way? Because why is my body responding? I had a client who came in, he was molested by his friend's father when he was 12 years old. And because his body had a physical response, he's like, does that mean that I wanted it? And maybe that means I'm gay. And, it was very confusing for his sense of self. So it's helpful and clarifying that your body may respond to things that you don't want psychologically and emotionally. Desire, in the way that Nagoski writes about it, is about this embodied desire. Like, psychologically, I want to be sexual. This is sexually relevant for me. I want to share my sexual self and be aroused with you. And that requires more emotional investment and choice, right? One of the things that the research points to is that men and women are different in terms of their desire arousal pattern. And so men are much more likely to have a one-to-one correlation between arousal and desire. It doesn't mean that men lack any judgment or choice, but men aren't as likely to get aroused by things that aren't congruent with what they find desirable, where women were actually more responsive than men, but to things that they found absolutely undesirable. So like watching bonobo apes copulating, women's bodies would respond, but they felt zero psychological desire, right? So it kind of pointed to the fact that women are actually quite responsive and sensual, which I think fits a lot of our ideas about differences between men and women, actually, when we think about it. I mean, we do a lot of saying women aren't very sexual, but really women are rather responsive and emotive and attuned to their environments. And so they found that women, in terms of arousal, were actually much more responsive than they were desirous and more responsive than men. But then if they indicated whether or not they were psychologically invested in that, women were much choosier than men. So there was a bigger gap between arousal and desire, and women were slower to move into psychological desire. And I think this fits from a psychobiological perspective in terms of women have more to lose in being sexual. And so the fact that women are prudent and picky about where they show up sexually certainly fits in terms of who do you want to reproduce with, and do you want to let this person into your body? There's a bigger risk to you in terms of disease and reproduction and death through childbirth, right? It's a big deal, women getting pregnant historically. So it certainly makes sense to be slow to desire, or at least prudent in that decision making. So I think that's important work. And I think that what this person's asking, I think this person understands that distinction already. They're saying, so the fact that she may not be into it at first, but after we do some sexually relevant things, she does move into it. Like, isn't that kind of in the frame of duty sex, or she didn't really want it in the beginning? Okay, so I'm going to say more about that, but let me just give another idea. Is that I also think there's such a thing as desire before arousal for women, okay, and men. Okay, so that is to say, when sex is a place that is rejuvenating for you, that you like to be there for yourself, you like to be there with your spouse, that it's something that's positive in your life, well, I think that you can have desire before arousal in the sense that you may not be having aroused desire, obviously, but you can be like, I like to go there. I would like to do that tonight. I want to make time for it because it's a good part of our lives. And so there's this other piece of, basically before there's any explicit physiological arousal, it's something you want to try and create together. Okay. So I think a lot of times when people lack desire it's a physiological thing, it's a difference, right? And it's okay. And taking all that personally is not a good idea. But on the other hand, if somebody kind of consistently lacks desire to work, to go to that space, it's certainly worth thinking about why, right? Because as you maybe heard me say too much, like sometimes I say these things a lot, is that, desire is very much linked to a sense of freedom. And so a lot of people that have low desire don't feel free in their lives, in their relationship to themselves, in their relationship to their spouse. They see sex more as something that they have to do or provide to manage the higher desire person's sense of self, to earn their legitimacy in the marriage. But if you feel like you're earning something or managing something, sex isn't linked to freedom. And so it's not a place you really want to go, even if the orgasm feels good enough, or you now have earned 3 days of peace or something like that. So sometimes people want to have sex because there are some upsides, but they don't desire it in the sense that it's a place that they know is not just good for the marriage, but it's good for them too. So it's always worth thinking about, why don't I desire it? What's happening that makes me not want this? And that doesn't mean it implicates the higher desire person necessarily, could, but it might also be about how you think about what sex is, how you relate to yourself in sex. But there's usually a meaning that challenges your sense of freedom, your sense of self, that's undermining desire independent of arousal. So I think that the question that the questioner is trying to figure out is, if embodied desire comes after some initial sexual engagement, when is it just getting through the act, meaning it's resentful or begrudging, versus a wholehearted choice, even if it kind of lags in its physical manifestation, right? And so I think, for example, I may be stressed or distracted in my life, right? But I know that I want to go there. So it's kind of wholehearted from the beginning, even if there's no physiological arousal or even a guarantee. Once you get into your 50s, your body's a little less predictable. Even if there's no guarantee that your body's going to do what you want it to do, there's still desire at the front because it's where you like to be with your spouse. So it's a heart choice, right? It's heart-based. And I think what a lot of people frame a lot of their questions around sexuality is, how do I explain this? A lot of times they're talking about it in terms of, I don't get the sex I want. And it gets framed more in the idea that I'm not getting the orgasms I want, or I'm not getting serviced, taken care of in this way, rather than our relationship sort of lacks this sense of passion or choice or desire, like that you want me, that you want to be with me. It's almost easier to talk about it in terms of, I'm not getting the sex I want. It's an easier frame in some ways, but it actually interferes with creating something better. So what I think is dangerous for couples is when they go along, so the lower desire person goes along with the sex, but resents. Maybe opens up her body, but not her heart. Okay. You go along, but you make the person pay. You make them feel that you're not there. You treat them like they're an obligation on some level. That's when it's dangerous to the couple. And being willing to accept that as the higher desire person or offering that as the lower desire person concretizes a meaning that is humiliating to both people. And while it might afford each person more of a sense of control that we often really want more than we want intimacy or choice, because it's very important. Because we all want to be chosen, but we want to be chosen without the risk of not being chosen. We want to be desired without the really giving our partner a choice. Most of us want control that duty sex affords. I mean, it doesn't really. It just gives you the illusion of control. So I'll take your crappy offering of duty sex because then at least I don't have to just sort of sit in my own discomfort and fear that I'll never be chosen. I don't have to sit with my own self-rejection or my own uncertainty because I've secured something. I've kind of secured your accommodation. And that can give us a sense of control, but it's kind of a false sense. It's not worthy. It doesn't make you feel good. It doesn't make you feel chosen. It just makes you feel maybe less acutely aware of the state of your relationship. Duty sex is similar to the accommodator, the one giving it, is it can give you some false sense that you're being good, you're doing your job, you're managing this higher desire person and their sense of self, but it allows you to step away from the issue of what your real choices are and what you're in fact participating in and creating through engaging in this servicing frame. One of the things I think we do in our LDS culture is we talk about marriage much more in terms of serving each other. These are like certain things that kind of drive me a little bit crazy. And I think because it's this idea that marriages are sort of distant, but you kind of placate and manage each other and you take care of each other in this kind of arm's length way that often gets framed as serving. Sex gets easily placed into that frame for many women. That's the advice they got from their mothers on their wedding day and things like that. But it concretizes non-intimate, non-choice-based marriages. And I think we have a lot of language around marriage that's more about roles and serving or servicing as opposed to intimate marriages, which I think we really crave and long for. We want to be chosen among other options. We want to feel that we're really accepted as a whole person. And while we all want that, I think, and the low desire person in some ways has it, I know that qualification needs to be given for that, but I'll just stick with that for right now, that we want it, but to offer it is entirely different and much more frightening. Duty sex is a way of trying to get around that question. Accepting duty sex is a way of getting around that question. Not having to take the real risk of letting your spouse have a real choice and managing your own sense of self rather than asking them to manage it. That's what we do when we're immature. So when you're the higher desire person and you're willing to accept duty sex or just being accommodated, I think if you're honest with yourself, you can feel it. Does my lower desire spouse, was she or he slow to become aroused? But I know that they really want to be here and they're not just managing me, or I can feel that they want to be here. Or am I being placated? Is there some resentment and annoyance there? Okay. So you have to map what it is that your spouse is really doing. If you make it so hard for your spouse to say no, that they're pretending to be into it, you're setting it up to get that control while making sure through all of your pressure that they never really have a choice. A lot of us say we want intimate marriages. A lot of us say we want to be chosen, but our behavior betrays another desire. We want control. So you have to really look at your behavior as the best indicator of your desires. And what does your spouse know about your behavior that your stories about your behavior are keeping from you seeing? If you accept duty sex, you're giving the message that you'll tolerate not being chosen. You're giving the message that you'll take what's not being offered. I worked with a lot of people who do this. They know the person doesn't want what they're doing, but at least in some of the cases I'm working with, she will go along. She doesn't want the negative cost of not saying yes. She doesn't want the judgment. She doesn't want the anger. But she also doesn't want to make a real choice. So it's like her way of saying, I'm going to tolerate you and you're the jerk, but I'll go along. So you're both saying you're willing to not be chosen by accepting it, but you're also saying you're willing to take something that she's not or he's not really offering. And that's also a betrayal of who you are, an exposure of who you are. So you're participating in a kind of humiliating sexuality that's humiliating to both of you. And it's a way of keeping the marriage from being intimate and choice-based. You are stepping in to get the choice off the table and to not allow what is there to be exposed. It can seem safer, right? To say, well, I did my job, I put up with him, it can be easy to say, like, you don't really have an option because he or she gets so upset if you're, the higher desire person. But I think in both cases, you're making sure that you don't take responsibility for yourself and the implications of your actual choices on the marriage. And you're making it your spouse's problem, not your own. And you're also making sure the marriage stays in a using frame, not a choice frame. I think it's really good to think about, what are my choices creating? Because you live in that marriage. You have to breathe the air of that marriage. So if you're polluting it through your indulgent choices or your fear-based choices, then you have to live in the ramifications of those choices. So really looking at, who am I in this dynamic as either the higher desire person or the lower desire person? Okay, how do you reconcile responsive desire with duty sex? Right, that's really the question I am starting to answer, right? So responsive desire is fine if you really want to be there, right? Duty sex is, okay, I'll go through the motions, but I'll make you pay for it. My body might be here, but my heart's not here. It's really about, can I choose this? You can choose it, then do the things that will help your body get physiologically aroused and psychologically aroused. You can be physiologically aroused because you make yourself available to it, and then make a choice to move into psychological arousal. Psychological arousal has a lot to do with making a choice, right? So if I know I'm becoming physiologically aroused just because I'm lying next to my husband, he's touching me, but I'm not psychologically, my brain's thinking about, workshops and things, I don't know, whatever it might be thinking about. And so then I have a choice to make, like, am I going to move into this territory or not? Because it's really on me. I'm starting to move into the territory that creates that within me and between us. Then I start kind of evoking the meanings that are familiar and that I like, and moving my brain into that area. So it's very much a deliberate process. I think a lot of us think, well, if the desire would happen, I'd want it. And we want the idea that sexuality should happen to us, rather than we are very much the participants in our sexual arousal, very much the participants in creating a relationship to sexuality and ourselves and sexuality and our spouse that requires some investment and decision on our part. And, as long as we can kind of say it's not up to me, I think that kind of allows us to not really reconcile our relationship with our sexuality. I think that scares a lot of us. What are your feelings about doing a sex fast to help remove duty sex? Let me just think about that. I mean, I don't know a lot about sex fasts. I see people talk about doing them and things like that. I don't know a lot of, I mean, I know about like tantric types of things where you're avoiding orgasm and just engaging intimately and allowing yourself to be aroused, but not orgasming as a way of building up that sexual interest and desire. The sex fast idea, I don't know if you mean it in an official kind of long-term sense, but I think the best way to not have duty sex be a part of the marriage is to not say yes to duty sex, not let yourself either offer it nor receive it. Okay, you can't control what the other person does. You could just control your half of that. And doesn't require an official fast. It requires tracking and mapping yourself and your partner and making decisions around what kind of a relationship you want to create through your choices. To make it an official thing, the only thing I'd be worried about in that is that it might, I mean, I think you could say, like, let's just take 30 days to kind of reset and then we can revisit. I think you could do that if it felt important to do that. But I think the thing about a sex fast is often what happens is the high desire person is now kind of fully putting the weight of the sexual relationship onto the low desire person and saying, let me know when you're going to stop giving me this crappy sex. And it kind of is a way of kind of punishing the low desire person for their half of the deal rather than looking at the dynamic and the role of the higher desire person in that dynamic that's existed for a while. You can break that dynamic if you're really confronting your own participation in an obligation frame from the high desire position. You just want to track and be careful about any self-righteousness, because a lot of times it's the idea that the low desire person did this to me rather than we've been a part of a dance and I want to break my half of that dance. And how do I think it's best for me to do that for myself rather than trying to manage the other person through your choices? What advice would you give to someone who's either offering or tolerating duty sex? That was another question that was on the group. So I think it's to choose one way or the other, right? So if I accept duty sex, I'm accepting a marriage based on obligation, based on being tolerated and not chosen. I may like the perceived control. Maybe the orgasms are worth it to me for the debasement of both of us, right? But that's the choice you have to face, okay? That if I accept it, I am agreeing to a certain kind of marriage. Or I can make a decision about how I'm going to be in relationship to myself, how I'm going to relationship to my partnership, and choose consistently with that. Okay, so I know these are conceptual, but that's where it all is. What's the meaning that my choices are participating in creating? Low desire people can say, well, I'm, how to say it? I'll go on to a question where this is a part of it, but it's like I keep offering kind of duty sex while I resent this idea that I'm supposed to service him, and yet I keep validating that idea through my choices rather than standing up and really making a different kind of choice, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so this person writes, my husband has told me that if I can't show him that sex is as important to me as it is to him, then we have irreconcilable differences, and he would divorce me. Once when he was saying he wanted a divorce and I didn't, he told me that I could turn things around if I'd just have sex with him. I said I can't have sex without commitment, and he replied that he can't commit to a relationship if there's no promise of sex, right? So this is a struggle, in my view, in this couple between each of their senses of self. So as Schnarch has said, and I've probably said to you ad nauseum at this point, that belonging to our sense of self is more important to us than being sexual. This couple is having a struggle around the issue of themselves, and it's getting played out in a power struggle between them around sex, right? So he wants sexual approval, right? He wants to know that he matters, that she desires him. And so she's trying to get that, but she wants to fend off being wanted for just sex. That's the idea. Like, I don't want you to just value me because I service you in this way. And so she's trying to manage her sense of self by saying, I'm not going to give you that. She's putting sex into the frame of servicing, and therefore she can reject it. And so those are each meanings that exist in the person, meaning they're each trying to get validation through the other person and they're going in opposite directions. They're based on the other person's choices. They're not based in who you are and what you're going to create in your marriage. So that's always where the locus of control is. You can't control the other person, but you can control what you're participating in. So she goes on to say, we were in a stalemate after nearly following through with his threat, and this time I was ready to let him. We decided to try and save the marriage by working on ourselves, and we put sex on the shelf to give it time to heal. I have tried to develop my sexual self more, and I've taken the Art of Desire course. I've read books and can get excited and in the mood. But then, when I'm with him, it tanks. Okay. And I think that's because the meaning of validating his demand or earning your place in the marriage makes you angry, makes you feel trapped. And so desire plummets. Again, the freedom goes away. You feel like you're earning your keep. And so even though you're capable of sexual interest and you've been developing your sexuality and you feel it more in your life, when you're away from him, the moment of meeting, the sense of meaning between you, or at least the familiar meaning, hijacks your desire, and you go into preserving your sense of self through not wanting him. Okay. So this is, again, how much the meaning shapes sexuality as human beings. That's the good news and the bad news. Okay. I mean, good. So it makes it good because if you want high meaning sexuality, you want sex to be about love and choice and connection. It's a wonderful part of human experience. But those meanings, especially when they're operating around the questions of who you are and how much you're valued and all that, will really undermine freedom in marriage around sexuality. Okay. So she goes on to say, I don't know if I'm just low desire or demisexual or if it's merely good judgment, but this pressure to be sexual to stay married has made my desire for sex with him lower than ever. We've talked about how it makes me feel that he doesn't care about me except what I can give him, and that I'm somehow being taken advantage of, or that if something happened and I couldn't give him sex, he would leave me. Of course, he tells me that he loves me and he wouldn't leave me if I had a legitimate reason for not having sex, but sex is still really important to him. And I think there's often this false idea that low desire people tell themselves, which is you, high desire person, are only here for the sex. And I think if that were really true, the high desire person often would have left a long time ago. Okay. But that framing, I think it feels true, but I think that framing serves the low desire person's fears and anxieties about sexuality and intimacy. And sometimes the high desire person's helping with that, meaning they're participating in that meaning. Okay. But if you say like, you're only here for the sex and you just want me for sex and I don't want to be sexual till I know you're here no matter what, it's like a mind trick that allows you to say, I would be sexual if you would do your part. He says, I'd love you if you'd do your part. Right? Okay. Rather than self-confronting about how you're using the other person's limitations to get around your own. Right? Often low desire people have quite a bit of difficulty managing being at peace with their sexuality, managing their sense of self and what they want when they know what other people want from them. So they have a hard time holding on to and stabilizing their sense of self in the face of the pressures or the mapped desires in the higher desire person. So they take what they can see and feel as a kind of obstruction or obliteration of who they are. And so the way they handle their sense of self is to kind of disinvest and disengage, rather than the way I'm going to have a self is I have to make a decision about whether or not I want to create an intimate partnership, a marriage that has sexuality in it. And if I do, what do I need to address in me to create a sexual relationship that isn't service framed, isn't about me just managing his sexuality, is something that would be more meaningful for us. We can sort of borrow a narrative in church discourse, which is like that sex is inherently hedonistic, sex is inherently selfish. So it's kind of a way that lower desire people can dismiss that sexuality. It's a way that you can kind of, write it off as something that it's noble of you to put up with, rather than the reality that I think we all expect is that our marriages are sexual in nature, that they are romantic partnerships, that there's an assumption of sexuality being shared there. That's why women don't like it when their husbands are looking at porn. It's a perceived rupture of that assumption that the sexuality isn't really being brought to the marriage. But the low desire person who says, well, you're selfish for wanting sex, it's a similar betrayal of a kind of working assumption. Now, that doesn't mean, oh, then you should just put out and manage, the higher desire person's needs. No, that's not the option. That's not the only option. And that's where I think low desire people or people with anxiety about sex often frame it as it's either I am a doormat and capitulate, or I stand up for myself and say no. And those aren't the only two options. You can think about, how do I participate in creating a sexual relationship that is about love, that is about caring, that isn't about just managing your neediness. This is an example, I think it kind of captures it, where I was working with a couple where they very much were in that dynamic. He was the high desire person, she was the low desire person. When he would kiss her, she would feel smothered. She would be kind of fending him off. She'd be kind of pulling back. She kind of hated every minute of it. But the way she's in the relationship, both in that kiss and in every other sense, is like this, like I'm putting up with you. And he would feel needy enough, desperate enough, self-betraying enough that he'd kind of go and try and still get it from her and try to get what she wasn't offering. Well, as she was kind of confronting her own role in this dynamic more, he started to kiss her. And instead of pulling back, she leaned in and she started to kiss him, right? Not just be kissed, but kiss him. Well, he could immediately map that and map the difference. And so he settled down and he started to feel her more and be in response to her more, not just him trying to go get something. And so as he settled down more, she both had the sense of agency within her, the locus of control within her, which is extremely important in sex. Okay. Surrender is this sort of paradox of you're surrendering, but because you have a solid enough self that you don't feel like you're literally losing yourself. That's the paradox that allows you to surrender, because you trust in your ability to ultimately be anchored within yourself. So as she started to kiss him back, the locus of control is in her. She's not turning it over to him and then resisting him. He can feel it. She's now a participant in the kissing. He actually self-regulates because he tracks her presence. And he's more responsive to her and stops smothering her, starts kissing her better, feels the validation of her kissing, so there's more kindness in his responsiveness. And they actually have an intimate kissing experience, okay? You might think kissing is a step down from sex, but kissing is often harder for people than intercourse because you are more able to map people's minds in kissing than you are through intercourse. But my point is, as the lower desire person takes more agency, takes up more of their half of the dance and the dynamic, it often has a massive impact on the other person. Now, I'm not here to say, it's all the low desire person's fault, or like that he could have not wanted her to be a participant. Some people want to have the control. They don't want to be in a mutual relationship. So I'm not saying that's always how the high desire person would respond, but certainly it's the way to find out what the marriage can be, is when you start to take up your part of a shared reality. I think a lot of times people want an equal relationship. They want to be treated like an equal. They want to be respected, but they don't act in or function from a respectful interior place. And as long as you're giving your power away, you can't ever feel that sense of freedom and control, not control of others, but self-control that's inherent to a sense of safety in a partnership. I don't know if I read this. We did the SYR course, and I told him I needed him to take the Art of Loving course before we go back to being sexual. He's almost done. And so far, he's been pretty patient with me. As long as I show that I'm working on myself and not just content with a sexless marriage, his greatest fear. Right. because I think his greatest fear may be a dead marriage. So I think there's proof right there that he's invested in a marriage that's alive. He's saying, if you're really working on your sexuality and you're trying to create something with me that's meaningful for you, I can be very patient if that's really what's happening. That's kind of proof positive that this is not just about his sexual gratification. He doesn't care what it means to you. He's saying, I want a marriage that feels alive, that feels wholehearted, not just being serviced all the time and basically putting you through the suffering of it. That's not what I want. So his greatest fear may be a dead marriage, a marriage that's lacking in wholeheartedness, a passionless marriage. It's quite painful. I mean, we want to be desired. She goes on to say, we also bought the enhancing sexual intimacy course, but I'm still not feeling sexual desire for him. And so I'm terrified of opening up that can of worms. Unfortunately, his patience is waning, and I'm afraid our fears will end up being self-fulfilling prophecies. And I think that's right on point. That's often what happens, is when you get really fixated on the other person, but not your own participation in the problem, it often does become self-fulfilling. I'll come back to those questions that are coming up here in a second. What can I do to reframe sex into less of a threat, and how can he be more reassuring that he is committed? How can we get out of the stalemate? So I'm going to say something you might not like. I don't think there's any evidence here that this is just a person who just wants orgasms or he's out. Okay. I think he's a person who wants a more whole marriage. Now, I'm not saying he's perfect in that or that there isn't some duplicity in his own position, because he may well want it, but not yet be fully prepared to offer it or to understand what that might mean in terms of your strength emerging more. So I'm not saying that he doesn't have blind spots in his desire, but I don't think there's evidence that this is just a guy who's looking to be serviced or he's gone. I don't think that's a helpful idea for you. I don't think it's fair. I think it's a way, it's a meaning that your mind wants, because it gets you out of your anxiety about growing into full psychological and relational adulthood and taking more responsibility for yourself as a sexual partner. And so I think you have to say to yourself, if he was in it for the sex, he would have left a long time ago. I've never really chosen him sexually. I've not really chosen to create a sexually intimate marriage. He has issue with that. That makes sense. If he were saying, this happens a lot of times where men will say, I want to be married to you, but I don't want to have a sexually intimate marriage with you. I prefer porn or no sex at all. And I don't really want you. Well, of course, those women are always high desire women, right? Not because just low desires always go find high desires, but because the meaning is different. You don't want me sexually? Like, what is the matter with me? Like, that makes you want sex because now you want to be wanted by your low desire husband. And when he's looking at porn instead of having sex with you, it feels intensely invalidating. That's not because you're so hedonistic and you just want orgasms. It's that you want to be chosen, sexuality and all. Okay. So this is a human desire we have. I think it's what your husband wants. He wants to feel chosen. I think the place for you to focus is on, do I want to choose this man? Okay. Get that locus of control in you, because when your mind puts it in him, he's going to leave me if I don't produce. Your body is shutting down. It's like, no way, we're not doing that. If you're like, no, I don't have to do this. I don't have to be sexual. I have real choices. I've had them all along in the marriage. I can't control whether or not he wants a sexual relationship. He does want it. I can control whether or not I want to create that with him or not. I have real choices. I may not like the consequences of my choices. I may not like the anxiety that my choices bring up in me, but I have real choices to make. And so what do I choose? And I'm in the driver's seat and I get to decide. And that doesn't mean I just have to submit to whatever he wants. And, I don't have, no, I get to create, like in the kissing metaphor, I get to be a participant in this to create sex worth wanting. And it's not strange that he wants it. What would it feel like if I were in his shoes and he were in mine? I'm sure you could relate if you felt like he never ever wanted you. I also think low desire people have to kind of confront that avoiding sex doesn't actually help you claim your value in the marriage. It's just a way of kind of stepping away from your fears and the fear of exposure and the inherent risk of an intimate marriage. but it's defensive and it's fear-based. And so it reinforces the idea that you don't have control. It reinforces the idea that the control is in your partner's mind, which only increases your anxiety. So if you want less fear, you have to move towards the things that scare you. If you step towards the things that scare you, you get more competent at them, you get more capable. Your mind settles down that you really are in the driver's seat. But if you keep stepping away, it keeps reinforcing that the people around you control your value in your life. And so you'll always live at arm's length and in resistance. And then I'll just say, the high desire person in this marriage, it's possible that he's tolerated or preferred control and sexual validation and has been complicit in that low intimacy marriage. I think there's a decent chance of it, but that doesn't mean that putting up a wall will solve it. It means you step in with a different meaning, that you really, if you want to be chosen for you, you really choose him for him, and you choose in a wholehearted way and inclusive of sexuality. Okay, this person says, yes, the how is the issue. This all makes sense in theory, but the practical application, okay, brain, just think differently. No, I know that's true. It's hard. It is about thinking differently. And it's about, the fastest way to change the brain is different action. A lot of times we want to just be like and I'm not managing our minds and our thoughts and the meanings is very important. It's a big deal. And so how we think about meanings of what we're doing is a valuable starting place to say, okay, wait, I keep doing something that actually reinforces my sense of lacking control, and I have choices to make. Okay, that's an important starting place for thinking. What choices do I want to make? Self-confronting, taking that locus of control in you. I can shape this marriage. I'm equally shaping of it as my husband. I am an equal participant. What do I want? Then you sort out what are the behaviors consistent with what I desire, with what I want to create. And then you do the very scary thing of engaging those behaviors, because those new behaviors, those new actions are expressions of your desire. They're expressions of yourself in development. And the more you step into the uncertainty towards behaviors that you believe are good and better, that's what faith is, right? Faith leads to knowledge. Stepping into new behaviors that scare you, that are outside of your comfort zone, will change your brain. They'll expand your sense of self. They'll expand your sense of control, the locus of control in your life. They will reinforce your sense of strength. The reality is that thinking about what is the thing that scares me to do, but I can feel it would be good for me to do it, then doing it and tolerating the disequilibrium of it. But that's the process of brain evolution and personal development. Okay, so in reference to the wife's desire plummeting, how does she get to a place where she feels safe to engage, especially if she feels lack of freedom? One thing that I suggest people do, and I talk about this in the Enhancing Sexual Intimacy course, is to not go beyond where they can kind of manage and work with the meaning. So, the rigors of sex, the exposure in sex, often the meanings that have been building up over years of time are just so dominant that it's hard to hold on to a new meaning. And so your limbic brain or your reactive brain is coming in and kind of shutting down all the desire, and you've lost your ability to think about what the new meaning is. And you're like, what did she say in that Facebook Live? I can't even hold on to any of it. That just means the optimal window of change is like around a 7 and 8 of distress. Okay, so when you're exercising, I like to exercise like at a 5, where I'm like sort of bored and kind of doing stuff, but not really challenging myself. If you're exercising at a 10, you can do damage. But if you're actually creating new muscle, changes to your body, you're doing it around a 7 or an 8. It's uncomfortable. You're kind of looking forward to it ending. It's stretching you, so to speak, but it's creating change. It's very similar with brain activity. Like if you are in the deep end and you are overwhelmed, it's not going to do any good for you. If you're always stepping outside of anything that stretches you and makes you uncomfortable, you won't change. So you want to be where you're in that sort of optimal zone of stress, where you're pushing against the meanings. There's different levels of engagement that I talk about in the Enhancing Sexual Intimacy course that come from Schnarch's work, of like hugging till relaxed. That you're working, for example, in that hug to regulate your sense of self, to hold on to your sense as an equal, for example. If you don't feel your spouse's desire, to still regulate and calm yourself down and hold on to your dignity, whether or not your spouse is working with his or her difficulty. So, you're working on self-regulation with intimate mind-to-mind contact. And then you slowly increase how much exposure there is, how much sexuality there is. That's a way of increasing the sense of being able to be yourself and be in the partnership. This is also very related, of course, to how people are in relationship to each other in their day-to-day lives. That's a lot of the work that I'm doing is even in addressing the sexual relationship, is how are these issues of freedom operating in the marriage themselves. And to be clear, I'm not saying that the lack of freedom is like the high desire person's fault, right? Or the person in the marriage who is more explicit about the things she or he wants, but often about how one's in relationship to oneself and the world will shape their sense of personal freedom. If we create vertical relationships, we never feel free. We always feel dependent on each other. I need to dominate you or I need to submit to you for us to be okay. But anytime you have to do either of those, it compromises your sense of freedom because it's inherently dependent. The more that we're in horizontal relationships, same as relationships, the more we feel free to know each other, the more free we feel to be ourselves, the more we feel free to express who we are and be in connection. Those are the people that feel free and feel joyful in their marriages and their sexual relationships. So what you're trying to get at is if you go into one down or one up in that duty sex frame, which is really what it's about, trying to extract something or give something over to get control by having given it over, that you will never be at peace with each other. And so it means if you're going one down resentfully, is you're pulling yourself up to the responsibility and freedom of being an equal. And if you're one up and, taking duty sex or whatever, that you're stepping back and really letting your partner have a choice, and you're not pressuring or punishing. You're letting them have a choice, although you don't deny that you want a sexually intimate relationship, but you're willing to do your part in creating it and confronting where you have participated in this kind of a relationship. How do you request novelty and variety that pushes your partner's anxiety while not accepting something that isn't being offered? Well, I would say it's about intimacy, not control. So intimacy is, I would really like this. I like this idea. I would love to do this with you. Here's all the reasons I like the idea. I'm showing you who I am and the ways that I'm weird. But you really do have a choice. And it's one thing for your lower desire spouse around whatever that is to say, well, I'm willing to try it a couple times, but then I reserve the right to say no. Like I'm willing to see if I can like this too. And so there might be some initial accommodation, but again, it's not like, all right, I'll do it so that you're not mad at me. That's participating in an obligation frame from either side of that. It's another thing to say, well, I don't really love the idea, but I'm willing to give it a try and see what I think of it. What you just have to do is, this is really tricky for people. I talk about this a lot in the men's course, which is, can you claim who you are or show who you are without going over the boundary and then pressuring them to validate it? People that are often confident or clear about what they want often don't see how much they demand validation of other people to reinforce that confident position, that supposedly confident position. And so if you're really confident, you can claim who you are and what you desire without demanding that your spouse validate and approve it. I'm recognizing I'm out of time here. Let me just see if there's anything else quickly that came up here. Yeah, I think showing up with your heart is a big deal. When you show up with your heart, that's when you know it's not duty sex. Is you like the person. You want them there. I mean, you can even be, let's say you're stressed and overwhelmed and you just know you're not going to get there. You can genuinely say, I want you to be with me. I want to have sex with you. I don't know if my body will get there, but I genuinely want you here. And you can 100% mean it. Okay. it doesn't have to be linked necessarily to your direct arousal or your direct pleasure in that sense of an orgasm, because you can want to be close and you can want that other person near you and with you, and you can want their pleasure without any question whether or not you are going to have pleasure. So, and that's different than duty sex. You can even have an orgasm in duty sex, but still treat it like an obligation and treat it like you're putting up with the person. It's that I'm being tolerated feeling, or I'm just being managed. Well, that's a terrible feeling, but you want to also make sure, if you're the higher desire person, that you're not creating that while resenting that you get it. Okay, fun to be with all of you, and hope this was helpful, and I will see you next month.